Hey everybody, Paul here, and in this tutorial we're going to be focusing on coloring and toning. This is a follow-on tutorial from the last one, which basically focused on setting up a reference image and starting your illustration, and I think we finished around the inking stage. So today we're going to pick up from where we left off. There's a lot to take in this tutorial, so why don't we jump into Blender and get started. So with our inks completed, it is now time to do some coloring. The first step in any coloring methods for comics is known as flatting. This is when you fill in the major areas of color. So for example, we'll know that we've got this area over here with the skin, and all of the hair's got to be a certain color. And then, you know, smaller areas such as eyes, irises, lips, to bring out the detail. Now, if you're coming from a Photoshop or a Krita background, there are methods that you're used to when coloring, and I'm going to point out a couple of things in Blender that the grease pencil does similarly, and where you have to pay attention to the differences. Now, I have here the inks layer, and so what I'm going to do first, of course, is add a layer, and I'm going to call these flats. I'm going to move this below the inks. It is important to note how colors are applied. So let's go into draw mode. Let's select a pen like the ink pen, and let's set this to fill. I'm going to be working in vertex color mode, and automatically we have got a palette to work from. A little bit more about the palette in a moment. The material is just the solid fill material. Notice that we haven't created or populated this with several materials for all the different colors, and we won't need to. We can just use this one solid fill material. Another thing I'll point out, thanks to a commenter on the last video, I am working here in solid mode, but because solid mode, the viewport shading actually takes its lighting from the workbench style, there is a selection here where you can switch it from material, where you actually see the original materials that you'd stroked on, and you can switch that over to vertex, which shows you the vertex color. I'm going to begin with making this inks layer invisible and just working in the flats layer for a second. I'm just also going to lock off the inks just in case we accidentally do something to it. We have a number of fill tools. Obviously, you could use the ink pen set to solid stroke and just color in. But the problem with this is that if I go into edit mode for a moment, look, I think we're going to need the theme shading just to really see this. What you've gone ahead and done is created a stroke, okay? And the stroke is made up of a lot of lines. And so while we could very easily increase that and just do a nice big block color, you're sort of making a bit of a mess. The other way of doing it, of course, is to create a fill in which you trace out a fill. On an ink, it takes a long time to trace it out, and so there are some shortcuts which the grease pencil allows for you. So for instance, let's say that we had a few lines here, right? We could very easily fill this area with the fill bucket, click on that, and it will fill in what are known as these boundary lines. Now, on occasion, there is this cleanup boundary strokes, but it doesn't always seem to work, and so sometimes you'll have to go ahead and just erase those strokes if that doesn't work to leave the solid fill together. Even if you have a layer such as these ink lines, let's go back and use the world settings for this. We could even have this inks layer locked off. We could be working in our flats layer, and we can do a color fill by clicking here. And sure enough, we can very easily fill these areas, and let's say we gave her some nice blue hair. Okay, you can see that it will fill in the boundary lines. Now, take note of where I'm filling right now, because as soon as I zoom out, you'll notice this. There is a line here. The screen also acts as a boundary. This is a quick way of coloring, and if you've come from a Photoshop background, it's perfectly okay to color like this. But personally, the method that I prefer to use is to actually trace around areas. Because this is a picture drawn from a reference, we're not beholden to this reference color palette unless you're doing this portrait. There is a system which can extract a palette from this photograph. So if we were to go to say, go image, extract palette, then you automatically have this palette that is named after that particular picture, and it has taken all of the colors that it spotted at that threshold and has created a palette for you. So we can then very quickly, let's say we want to select a skin tone and draw in, our skin area or hair tone and draw in some hair, right? We can quickly fill in those colors based on the palette that's been extracted from this picture. But I'm going to do something a little bit different. I've actually created a palette here called Cyberpunk Girl. I'm going to go ahead and extract the palette from there. And let's take a look at our pencil setting. Okay, we can probably delete this woman one and go Cyberpunk Girl. And these colors, because they're blocks, they are now represented in this color palette here. The thing I like to do when coloring flats is to go from the furthest back to the front. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that we're going to use this color for the hair. We can quickly trace out a hair swatch, which is looking really good there. And then we can trace out a skin swatch on top of it. And by default, it usually will create a fill or a stroke over the pre-existing fill. Now, there's one thing that we want to check, and that is in our object data properties. If we open up the strokes dialog box, you'll see that the stroke depth order is 2D layers, and the stroke thickness is set to world space. We don't have to worry about the stroke thickness so much, but the 2D layers thing is important because if it's set to 3D location, what that means is that we're going to get this weird buzzing when rotating a little bit. Because what it's actually doing, if I just go into edit mode and grab that, is using the 3D location of that stroke to place one layer over the other. Whereas if it's set to 2D layers, it's clean because we're looking at the layers as they're created. Now, this is all in one layer, of course, but we could take this stroke and arrange it and send it to back. And now this is now actually behind that blue layer. We won't even see it on the flip side because it's in the order of the 2D layers that are facing us. So it is important to have the layers in the correct order when creating them. So quickly creating some fills, we then go into something like edit mode, and with our proportional fall off, we can just massage those points into shape, okay? Before moving on to the next part. And what I'm doing here is I'm middle mouse scrolling to adjust the amount of fall off that I'm using. Now, if you haven't got proportional fall off turned on, you just have to go up here to the little circle icon, and by switching that on so it's blue, I've got this set to connected only because that means it only moves the points that your selection is connected to. So now I'm just going to fill in the rest of this image before we go on, but sometimes we may need to add a few colors. Okay, so the way you do that is by clicking on this vertex color swatch here, changing it to the color that you want. In this case, I want 100% white, and then you hit this little plus key, and it adds the white to our selection. So with that selected, I can now fill in this eye color, these lips, eyes, and so on. And then in edit mode, I can just go ahead and massage those vertices so that they fill the required area that we're trying to keep colored. Now those flats are looking really, really nice. I'm just going to change this world color setting because I really like this light yellow here. And I'm going to go into my world and I'm going to click and drag this color onto the world color. And I'm going to switch over to my viewport shading because the world color doesn't seem to show up in my solid view, which is fine. So now with our flats done, and you'll notice that I've just skipped ahead and added this little earring color in here, which is this sort of nice pink, which complements the lip color and the cardigan color. I might just add that to our palette and just bring it over here to the pink shades. Now with our flats done, it's time to shade. Now there's so many ways that you can shade a comic illustration. I'm going to start with the quick and dirty way of doing it, and that is to have yourself some black and white in your palette. And over your flats, let's just lock that off. Let's add a new layer. You start by adding in a layer called shades. You set the blend to multiply and you drop down the opacity. Then you set another layer to highlights. You set that one to add, and again, you drop the opacity. Now, we'll just lock off the highlights for now, and we'll just focus on the shades, okay? We'll leave the opacity a little bit high just so that we can demonstrate what it looks like. And then all you do is with your ink pen tool and solid fill, and let's continue to use the vertex colors. Let's not build a new material or anything. You begin to draw out parts of the shading over your illustration for the darker areas of your illustration. Okay, and you can see that for high contrast colors such as the blue in this hair, it seems to work quite well. We're getting some very vibrant shadows. It even works really well over things like whites or eyes or things of that nature where you just want some gray tones to sneak in there, okay? But here is where it falls down. As soon as we start adding that to fairly pale skin tones like this, or on lips, it looks a little bit too grayed out. And when you start getting big swaths of shading on skin tones, okay? And yes, pardon me, I am working very roughly here. I generally don't like this grayness. It looks fairly muddy. And similarly with the highlights, okay? We go and we paint in white. You can see that it works really nicely there on the hair, but on skin, not so much. So what is the alternative? Well, I'm going to show you a little bit of a more advanced shading technique. So I'm just going to make those two layers invisible for now, and we'll lock those off. And let's add another layer, and we'll call this, let's call this toning, just to really sort of differentiate between the shades and the highlights. And we can leave this at regular. I'm going to set that world color back to 100% white. And we'll start with the skin tone, okay? I like to work with my solid stroke because even though I know that I sort of poo-pooed the idea of just drawing in strokes and everything like this is a very temporary thing, and it is working on a layer called toning. And what we're going to do is color in a few swatches. So here is the skin tone, here is the hair tone, here is the lips. Okay, and there's sort of our three major colors that we're using. We'll leave the earrings alone for the moment. Okay, so with our skin tone selected, I'm going to click on this swatch here, and just using the value, I'm going to drop the value and see what it looks like when I paint a lower value tone for the skin. Now, this is essentially what the multiply was doing, but we can go a little bit further. What if we gave this a little bit of a pinkish hue, or maybe even a purpley hue, so it looks like it's almost getting a bit of, radiosity from the hair, right? Maybe even a little bit blue, okay? And you can sort of experiment, and then we up the value, and we can push that into the opposite, maybe a little bit warmer there, okay? That's not high value enough. And if you sort of reach the maximum value, dropping the saturation really makes that a lot paler. And eventually what you get is a trifecta of colors that then when you paint on, it looks a lot more vibrant. Now, we can immediately apply that to the toning. So let's add those. So if we color pick that and add that color to our swatch, let's move that up near the skin tone, and then we'll color pick again the highlight and add that to the tone, and we'll put this over the other side of the skin tone. So here we've got our skin tones. Let's go over to solid fill, draw in a shadow here and a shadow over here. Okay, and yes, it looks a little bit weird. Then we can just drop that opacity a little bit, and let's just do a quick comparison between the shades, okay, that is just a straight value reduction, and the toning, which actually has a bit of vibrancy to it. And again, with the highlight color, okay, we can jump here on the toning and add a little bit there. This is almost non-existent. We may have to go to somewhere like a white for the skin tone to really take effect. And just sort of playing around with that opacity, what we end up doing is toning that color there. So I'm going to go ahead and time-lapse this and tone this entire picture to see what we get overall before we move on. Now moving on to the highlights, I'm going to create a new layer called Tones Light. You'll see that I've done a Tones Dark, and I've actually moved my toning one with all my swatches up here and locked it off so that I can toggle the opacity of the dark tones separate to the light tones and separate to the toning where I need that at 100%. Okay, so same deal as with the shading. The highlights is basically work on that layer, drop down thing, but keep the blend to regular, and then start working with the highlight set. And so, look, I'm quite happy with this result. I mean, this is a very quick demonstration, but what I want to show you next is how to add and utilize some effects that are available in Grease Pencil. And so, yes, we do actually have a Visual Effects Properties tab where you can add an effect. And so, let's just add something that is nice and interesting, like a glow, because, you know, a lot of anime likes to blow things out, and so by default doesn't look great. What we have to do is really up that sample rate, so I'm going to bump it right up because my computer can handle it. I'm going to up the threshold so only the most luminous parts of this actually glow, and that happens to be the face and the eyes there a little bit. Let's see what happens at 5.5. You can drop the opacity of that glow so you only get a little bit of that glow happening, and you can even change the color of the glow so you can get a more warmish tone or, you know, a darker, moodier tone. I'm going to go in for the pinks here, but that's just one thing you can do. I'm just going to switch this off for a second because I want to show you something else that you can do inside the viewport itself, and that is you can now add lighting. So what I'm going to do is in front view here, I'm going to Shift A, add a point lamp, and still in my material preview settings, I'm going to disable the scene world so we can really see what this looks like. But I'm going to keep the scene lights enabled because we really want to see what these scene lights actually do. You want to bump these lights up pretty high. Let's increase the radius of this lamp. And you want to put it in a place where it's actually going to illuminate something. And so there you can see that as I move it around, the lamp actually illuminates this picture. So let's set that over here, maybe drop that a little bit and maybe move it away from the image just enough so we get a little bit of that illumination. And then you can sort of colorize that lamp a little bit so you can sort of get nice mood lighting. Let's go with an orange there, and let's duplicate that lamp, bring that down here, okay? And we might go for something in a cooler tone, like a purple type color, okay? And we can sort of move that closer, all right, to really accentuate the mood there. And this is a really quick way of creating some almost like gradient fills on your image. But what you're really doing is just messing about with the lighting. Okay, so once you're sort of happy with how that looks, then you can take a look through your viewport. You've got these extra bits of shading there. And that accompanied with your effect, say, let's bring back that scene world. And when you're satisfied with your final result, you can just hit that render button and your final can be rendered. So I hope you got a lot out of that tutorial. As always, the working files are available via a link below this video. If you like what you see here and you want to be updated of any upcoming videos, do consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. And if you're feeling at all generous, you can join the legions of Patreon supporters over at patreon.com. It's the support I get on Patreon that makes the production of these videos possible. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Bye for now.